Hey, Econ Kids. This is Module 11 in Section 3 of Macro. So today we're going to be talking about GDP and real GDP. As you're looking at this module, GDP is going to tell us the economic size of a different country, right? And you're going to be able to use those to compare one country to another by how much stuff it makes. All right. Now, there's some things with GDP in terms of like nominal versus real. So nominal GDP simply is the total value of all your goods and services. So it's basically just a price times quantity kind of a thing, right? So I'm taking the price of everything, I'm multiplying it by the quantity of everything, and I'm going to get a number. And when I get that number for all the final goods and services, it's going to tell me how big your economy is. But some weird things can happen. For example, if I just raise the prices on everything, my GDP is going to grow. Now, I didn't make any more stuff. My economy might very well be stagnant. But because my price went up, my GDP is going to go up and everything's going to look like I'm advancing as an economy. So what can we do to sort of eliminate that problem of just having some inflation and raising up our prices? Well, what economists use is real GDP. So real GDP is the total value of all the goods and services produced in an economy during a given year, but you calculate that based on the prices of a base year. So we're going to take 1 year, we're like, hey, this is the price in whatever year that is, and then you take all the goods that you're producing this year, but you're multiplied by that price. Because then you should be able to compare year to year if you're actually producing more goods and services or if you're just seeing some inflation and a higher price. Okay, so to calculate this, you take the quantity in your given year multiplied by a base year. That's going to give you real GDP. As you look at this like graphic over here, it's going to show you like chairs and tables, right? Quantity and price of each. And what we're going to see is in year one, we have 10 chairs at $50, 2 tables at $250. How much is that? Well, if I look at just my nominal GDP, that's going to add up to $1,000. Now, if I go to year two, what I can see is I made 20 chairs, but the price has increased to $100. And the quantity of tables, I made 4 tables, but the price has increased to $500. So when I see what this is in year two, if I'm just looking at GDP like nominally, I'm going to have a $4,000 number. So that is showing me like a 300% increase in GDP, like 1,000 to 4,000 in terms of the dollars. Now, why did it do that? Like, why has my GDP grown? Is it going to be because I made more, or is it going to be because the prices just increased? If I use real GDP, right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a base year for my price. So if I use year one as my base year, and that will always be a given, like you will know what the base year is, okay? If I use year one as a base year, in year one, you can see over here, I got year one real GDP, it'll be like $1,000 of total, right? Year two real GDP, I'm going to take those same quantities, but I'm going to multiply them by the base year prices. And what you're going to see is I went from $1,000 to $2,000. So when I went from 1,000 to 4,000, there was definitely some inflation in there. And now when I went from 1,000 to 2,000, you're going to see there is no inflation in there. So when you're talking about nominal GDP does not account for inflation, right? But using real GDP and a base year does. So that's one of the reasons this real GDP is a pretty nice thing to use, because now all of a sudden we don't have to worry about inflation in our numbers. So when you think about that, figure out that change between years. You got real GDP or GDP year two minus GDP in year one divided by GDP in year one. You're going to get your percent there, and we're going to end up with just 100% increase in real GDP versus a 300% increase before. right? If we're just using nominal. Now, GDP per capita. What's going to happen now if we decide to take our GDP per capita, like before when we were going to say, hey, let's compare GDP across countries, right? If I use GDP per capita, so GDP per capita, that is going to say now all of a sudden I can determine a better comparison amongst countries, because now we're going to deal with population, right? So we're going to account for, hey, how much did like this country make divided by how many people are in that country? So an economy like China, which might be just this huge number, but when we start looking at it, GDP per capita, they have a huge population. So now I take that big number divided by a big population, it might not really be as great as maybe another country who had a pretty high number but less people, right? So when you think about this, it's kind of interesting to do some comparisons amongst countries that way. Now, a couple of things don't get included in GDP that do help out your economy. It's kind of weird that way. So if you look, volunteering, doing your own housework, having time for leisure, those are not GDP adding activities. It's odd. If you clean your own house, that doesn't add into GDP. But if you'd hire someone to come clean your house, that would add into GDP. So the same thing is happening. It's just one time it gets counted, one time it doesn't. And so when you clean your own house, you don't count into GDP, and that's kind of it almost seems like a negative then as a country to clean your own house. You should hire somebody to do it. Now, when you think about things it does include, when you have disease, natural disasters, crime, those all make you a little upset, but they all add into GDP. If you have a disease, you have to go to the doctor. You have to have medicine. You have to get taken care of. That is, all those bills are going to pile up. That's going to add into GDP. If you have a natural disaster, a hurricane comes in, wipes out your town, or a tornado tears through your town, you have to rebuild. That all adds into GDP. If somebody comes by and throws a rock through your window, crime happens, well, you have to buy a new window, adds to GDP. So it's weird sometimes that things like volunteering don't add in, but things like someone vandalizing something that causes you to have to clean it up or deal with it, that is going to add in. So GDP is an interesting measure. Sometimes people are critical of things like that, right? Like when you have some bad snowstorm caused a bunch of accidents, now you have to go repair your vehicle. Those are all negatives, right? But at the same time, repairing your vehicle, the shop that fixes it gets income, and that, of course, then is added into your GDP. So when you start looking at nominal GDP per capita, some of the countries that are near the top here, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Norway, okay, so all those kind of Scandinavian type countries up there seem to be doing okay. Then you look at the United States on the list is number 6, so not too bad. When you're looking at the rest of your GDP stuff, I mean, I guess moral of the story, there's positives, there's negatives, and it's interesting to try to measure and then do some comparison. But a lot of times when we compare, it's not telling us the whole story. So it's a measure, but it's not a perfect measure. Until next time.